If you're a fan of the literary arts, you might have heard about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Known as the oldest story ever written by man, this epic tells the story of an ancient king who waged war with none other than death itself. Gilgamesh's story has been passed down through the millennia, and interestingly, it appears that every religion or culture has its interpretation of it. However, it's always been thought that the epic was nothing more than a myth made up for people's amusement. There's a popular saying that art imitates life, and while many always thought the tale of Gilgamesh wasn't true, a recent archaeological discovery has disputed that fact. It would appear that what we have long believed about this god-man might not have been so false after all. So look, I know there have been a lot of discoveries made recently that show our world isn't necessarily what it is. However, this one could easily blow the rest out of the water. It's the type of discovery that will make you hold your head and wonder why no one else is talking about it. But we've got all the details you need to know right here, so join us on this incredible journey to the middle of the desert where we uncover one of the most mind-boggling discoveries ever made in recent times. The year was 2003, the location, the Iraqi desert. Just about a month before the war that decimated the Middle Eastern country, a team of archaeologists and researchers led by Jörg Fassbinder of the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich made a startling discovery. Deep in the Iraqi desert, Fassbinder and his team discovered a huge network of tombs, which they claimed were essentially inhabited by giant human-like beings. They eventually searched even deeper and found the bodies of other giants that had been dead and buried, supposedly for several millennia, as well as items and artifacts that had belonged to them. Besides all of this, the team reportedly discovered an entire landmass and settlement that had been buried for generations. According to Fassbinder, they found over 10,000 hectares of property and land, many of which appeared to have been described in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself.
Jörg Fassbinder of the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich told the BBC's World Services Science and Action program, quote, "I don't want to say definitively that it was the grave of King Gilgamesh, but it looks very similar to that described in the epic. We found just outside the city, an area in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building which could be interpreted as a burial," Mr. Fassbinder said. In the book, Gilgamesh is described as having been buried under the Euphrates.
He also added that they uncovered different Babylonian houses and properties that had been scattered around the area, all of which were buried underground for thousands of years. And now, a few years on, thanks to different whistleblower reports and emails released from top government officials, the truth has finally started to come out. Many believe that the tomb that was actually found was one belonging to Gilgamesh, the ancient king of Uruk. At this point, you probably have a few questions. Why is this discovery important, and what exactly is being hidden from us? Plus, who the heck is Gilgamesh? To understand the impact of this entire story, it's important to go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. Known as one of the first, if not the first, stories ever told, the epic describes the story of the giant godlike king called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh reportedly lived around 2500 BCE. He was reportedly the son of a Sumerian king and a Mesopotamian goddess. And thanks to his parents' genetic makeup, he was quite literally a god among men. Gilgamesh was said to have been about 17 feet tall, with enough strength to fight a lion and come out without a single scratch on his body. As part of the evidence of his existence, Gilgamesh was actually credited with having built the Great Walls of Uruk, the region which became Iraq today. And considering that the walls themselves are mentioned in the epic, I think it's safe to say there's some fact that Gilgamesh might truly have been a real person. Now, it is worth noting that the Epic of Gilgamesh itself wasn't written while he was alive. It was compiled from various historical records of the king, so it could have been a bit inaccurate. Nevertheless, as the epic goes, Gilgamesh was a despotic king who ruled his people with an iron fist. I mean, for a guy that was 17 feet tall, who knows, maybe his fists were literally made of iron. In any case, Gilgamesh wasn't necessarily loved by his people, and given that he was stronger than anyone else in the land, he could pretty much do whatever he wanted without giving a toss about them. Eventually, Anu, the king of the gods, came along and listened to the prayers of Gilgamesh's people to send them a liberator. So he used raw clay and his own spit to create Enkidu, a wild man who dwelled with the animals and seemingly came out of nowhere with a burning desire to beat the brakes off Gilgamesh. Enkidu eventually made his way to Uruk and challenged Gilgamesh to a duel. Both men had an epic fight that lasted for days on end, with nothing less than the fate of the kingdom literally on the line. Eventually, Gilgamesh came out on top in this fight, but for some reason, he chose not to kill Enkidu. I guess he was so impressed that someone could actually take him on for days. On the flip side, Enkidu also became a loyal friend and companion to the king. So just two buds with godlike powers roaming around the world with nothing and no one that could hold them back. What could go wrong, am I right? Well, a lot did go wrong. Gilgamesh and Enkidu got into a lot of trouble, setting out at one point to the cedar forest beyond the 7th mountain range. Their goal was to claim the mountain range for Gilgamesh and increase his influence. While there, the two met Humbabar, a monster with the face of a lion that protected the general wildlife there. Through some cunning and brute force, Gilgamesh and Enkidu murdered Humbabar, claiming his land. But while this caused a bit of an uproar among the inhabitants, our boys didn't care. Gilgamesh and Enkidu eventually went far enough when Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love and justice, reportedly tried to seduce Gilgamesh. The king rebuffed and scorned her, and she asked her parents Anu and Antu to give her the bull of heaven. Ishtar set the bull loose, charging it to kill her would-be lover, but once again Gilgamesh and Enkidu proved to be just too much of a match. The two men tag-teamed on the bull, with Enkidu holding his tail and Gilgamesh stabbing it in the neck. Enkidu eventually tore off the bull's limbs and hurled it at Ishtar. This, according to the gods, was a step too far. They sentenced Enkidu to death, with the wild man falling severely ill and eventually dying. Gilgamesh was crushed by his best friend's death. He reportedly didn't even want to believe that Enkidu was dead until he saw maggots coming out of the latter's nose. Grief-stricken, Gilgamesh spared no expense in mourning and burying his friend. It wasn't just the fact that Enkidu had died that traumatized Gilgamesh. He had suddenly been faced with his own mortality, as well as the fact that he would also die one day. Determined to find the secret of eternal life, Gilgamesh left Uruk to seek out Utnapishtim, a man whose name literally translated to the far away. Utnapishtim had been the lone survivor of a terrible flood that a god had sent to his homeland of Babylon. According to the story, he had been tasked by the god in question to create a massive ship called the Preserver of Life that would help him survive the flood, and he did. Gilgamesh was convinced Utnapishtim would know how to avoid death and guide him. He had to cross some pretty crazy obstacles to get there, including the Twin Peaks at the end of the earth, a tunnel guarded by two giant scorpions, and even the waters of death, but reach Utnapishtim he did. When the two men met, Utnapishtim reprimanded Gilgamesh for all he had done, but he also explained how he was able to build the Preserver of Life. Utnapishtim explained that the god who told him to build the vessel gave him specific details and asked that he take 2 of every animal he could find. Sound like the story of Noah from the Bible, anyone? Essentially, Utnapishtim was granted eternal life by the gods for his actions, so he didn't have much to offer Gilgamesh. The king was unconvinced, however, so Utnapishtim told him that he could help him if he went a week without sleeping. But try as he did, Gilgamesh just couldn't conquer sleep, showing that he wasn't worthy. Nevertheless, Utnapishtim pitied him and told him of a magical plant that could renew his youth at the bottom of the waters of death. Gilgamesh bound stones to his feet and immediately jumped into the sea. He obtained the plant, but while he bathed, a serpent stole it, and with it, Gilgamesh's last hope for immortality. Devastated, Gilgamesh returned home. The king spent his last days as a relatively peaceful man, showing that the trip he took kind of changed him. He eventually died in Uruk, with his body being buried at the site allegedly discovered by Fassbind and his team. So now we understand the Epic of Gilgamesh and who he was. While scholars continue to dispute whether or not he existed, the fact that Fassbinder and his team discovered this interesting site has raised a lot of eyebrows. Was it really the grave of Gilgamesh, or was it just some other grave site that might not necessarily be as historically relevant as Gilgamesh? For Fassbinder, the man who initially found this area, there was no doubt about the fact that this was the grave of Gilgamesh. Shortly after the grave was discovered, he spoke to the BBC, outlining everything that they had found and how significant it all was. Fassbinder also added that they had discovered what appeared to be the remains of a burial place just outside the city's walls as well. Nevertheless, other researchers and experts called the stories bluff. As far as they were concerned, there was something not right with Fassbinder's discovery and the links to the ancient Uruk king. For one, they pointed out that there was just no way that Gilgamesh existed since there weren't as many historical references to him. Most of the references had been mythological alone, with no real background in science or recorded history. And what's more, naysayers pointed out was that the bodies found weren't necessarily 17 feet tall like the epic claims that Gilgamesh was. But if you recall, it's been established that the epic was actually written centuries after Gilgamesh himself died. So it is possible that there was a few exaggerations in the story and that some things weren't necessarily as clear-cut as they seemed. Plus, come on guys, no one believes that things like the waters of death and others actually existed. So the epic might have been a bit imaginative and inaccurate, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a man with godlike strength, or perhaps even from a superior race like Gilgamesh, didn't exist. Ever since the discovery of Gilgamesh's grave was made public, many people from around the world have been asking whether this Sumerian king really did exist. And if he did exist, how do we know that there isn't an ancient civilization that lived much longer ago than we can remember or have records for? Well, interestingly, the answer to all of this might actually tie back to Christian theology. The Christian faith is rooted in the belief in God, the supreme being who created the entire world and who still controls its affairs. Christian stories are told from the Bible, which gives account of different events that happened in the world. One of the lesser-known tales in the Bible is that of the fallen angels. And no, I'm not talking about the Chris Brown song. In the book of Genesis, chapter 6, the Bible tells of rapid expansion among the first humans in the world. It reads, "Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose." The book essentially claims that angels from heaven came to the earth to have sexual relations with human women. The result of this sin was the birth of a race of humans called the Nephilim, people with superhuman strength and abilities who could pretty much do whatever they liked because they were stronger than everyone else. Now, if you recall from the epic, Gilgamesh was described as a superhuman who was also born of a god and a human. So could it be that he was a product of this same reproductive cycle? Another interesting biblical reference that ties to the epic of Gilgamesh is that of Noah and the flood. The book of Genesis also tells the tale of Noah, a man who was devout and very close to God, and was pretty much the only holy man left in the land. Everyone around had just about forgotten about God, but Noah held fast to his faith. Eventually, God told Noah that he was going to destroy the world via a massive flood and start all over because everyone had become so sinful. He then directed Noah to build an ark, basically a ship where he and his family would be safe. The ark would contain Noah, his wife, 3 sons and their wives, and just as well, the ark would contain 2 of every animal in the world, a male and a female. So once God was done wiping the world away, Noah and his family could begin repopulating the earth, and the animals could do the same for their races. And if you recall, the epic of Gilgamesh talks about him going to see Utnapishtim, who had survived a huge storm by creating a ship. The storm had wiped out his entire kingdom, but he managed to survive because he listened to the instructions and made the boat. Nevertheless, the discovery was understandably a shocker. Thanks to recent technologies, researchers could now test the theories and see if Gilgamesh really did exist. So you might be asking, what on earth happened to this discovery and all of the bodies? Well, let's just say that the US government had other plans. If there's ever been any conflict that has raised as many eyebrows in the past few years, it's got to be the war in Iraq. The entire conflict has pretty much shaped global geopolitics as we know it today, and it's landed a lot of people in infamy. Unwrapping the Iraq war on its own will probably take another video. Some believe the war began because of an interest in oil, while others claim it was a direct response to the 9/11 attacks. But what is especially interesting is that the war in Iraq actually started about a month after Fassbinder and his team discovered the grave of Gilgamesh. According to sources, the war essentially made it impossible for Fassbinder and his team to get the items they discovered, so they couldn't carbon date them or make additional findings to help them understand what they were dealing with. Left with nothing they could do and a need to save themselves, Fassbinder and his team left the area where they had made the groundbreaking discovery and fled the country. It's easy to think that this is nothing but a myth, but consider this: every single justifiable reason why the US invaded Iraq has been proven to be false. The official line was that the country had helped to plan the 9/11 attacks, but George W. Bush, the US president who started this entire thing, officially came out to say that they didn't.
What did Iraq have to do with what? The attack on the World Trade Center. Nothing, except for it's part of, and nobody's ever suggested in this administration that Saddam Hussein ordered the attack. Iraq was the lesson of September 11th is take threats before they fully materialize, Ken. Nobody's ever suggested.
For the others who think the invasion was to stop Iraq from developing nuclear weapons and instruments of mass destruction, well, guess what? Iraq wasn't.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass.
The only possible reason was that perhaps the government wanted to gain control of Iraq's massive oil reserves. But is that really a good enough reason to start a war that decimated a region and left it perpetually in flux? What if there was some other reason for this? What if there was something the US government really wanted to achieve in Iraq? Well, leaked emails to Hillary Clinton, a woman who, in case you forgot, has spent most of her adult life in government and even ran for president twice, shows that the powers that be just might have had a reason to keep this discovery a secret.
Now you can see here it says, this is from Denitra Senegar. That's who it's from. This is to Hillary Clinton. Important for context. And then it says, well, you can read it there. Can you see what it says? I mean, requesting documents pertaining to the resurrection chamber of Gilgamesh, the location of his body, and the location of the buried Nephilim.
Want to know what's even weirder? Witnesses claimed that the military immediately set up an encampment around the grave of Gilgamesh as soon as they landed in Iraq. They reportedly sent reporters and locals out of the region and pretty much overran the entire area. Some witnesses also claim that the military began excavating items from the site, moving them to an undisclosed location. And besides all this, reports of the discovery of Gilgamesh's grave were pretty much wiped off the internet. It was basically like this thing never existed. To be fair, this might all seem a bit extreme, but there's definitely a lot of overlap. As for why the government might be interested in Gilgamesh and his grave, there's also a bit of a theory. Corey Good, an independent investigator and YouTuber, claimed that the government and other members of the global elite might be looking to carry out DNA tests on Gilgamesh's corpse, as well as the other corpses found in the tomb. In an episode of Cosmic Disclosure that has now been deleted, Good claimed that there are several stasis chambers around the world where these giants are pretty much kept. No one knows if governments around the world are using these chambers as a way of preserving the bodies for the purpose of conducting these tests, but it sure won't be out of the ordinary to find that out. Now, you might think that the discovery of Gilgamesh and his grave might be the only weird thing to come out of Iraq, but you'd be wrong. This region could contain secrets about the origins of mankind as well as how we came to be. In March 1853, a group of men led by French scientist Paul-Émile Botta discovered an interesting find while digging for treasures in Khorsabad, Iraq. They found the remains of what appeared to be a massive Assyrian palace and with it a trove of Sumerian cuneiform inscriptions. When translated, the inscriptions showed what archaeologists believed to be the oldest civilization in the world, a group of superhuman beings known as the Anunnaki.